I'm delighted to be chosen to give the keynote lecture, Looping at BCDiabetes. Basically, I'm going to be telling you about the last 5 years of my professional life, which has been full of excitement. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we gather here today on the traditional territories of some First Nations people in the Greater Vancouver area. In terms of my disclosures, I am in the diabetes business. I run BCDiabetes for profit. I'm involved in clinical trials. I do speaking for Dexcom and Abbott. I'm on advisory boards, and I distribute large volumes of samples from Dexcom and Abbott. In terms of managing potential bias, I like to think I'm keeping things transparent. Please tell me if this is not the case. The plan today is to define loop, to give you the history of loop, to show you results from our clients who've been looping at BCDiabetes, to have you install loop on your phone and run a simulation, though this will mostly be done on your own time, not during this lecture, to then dive into loop settings and show you some examples of clients we've seen at BCDiabetes, and finally show you how to get involved with the excitement of looping, not just referring patients to BCDiabetes, but perhaps doing it yourself in your own clinic as a BCDiabetes affiliate. Well, loop is do-it-yourself automated insulin delivery. To do it the way we do it at BCDiabetes, you need an Omnipod Dash, a Dexcom G6 or G7, a smartphone, and an app that is not Health Canada approved. Now, you could build this app yourself or have a tech friend of yours do it, or you could come to BCDiabetes, where we will have built the app and we'll help you install it and maintain it at no cost. Each visit at BCDiabetes will be with a case manager overseen by one of our endocrinologists, and it will be billed as fee for service, so at no personal cost to our clients. What are the looping components here? They are visually. You can see the stomach of one of our loop patients who's allowed this, and other photos you'll see throughout the presentation. They've all have the client's consent. So she's wearing a Dash, a Dexcom G6, and on her phone is running Android APS, one of the flavors of DIY algorithms. Before I tell you how wonderful it is, let me tell you that it's not perfect. Loop is not perfect. No automated insulin delivery system, no system that involves humans is perfect. In terms of loop, patients still need to carb count, settings still need to be adjusted, and there is a chance that hardware may fail. Now, if we look at where the failures occur, the pods themselves fail only very rarely, about 1 per patient per year. Absorption site problems are client dependent, and these can be fairly frequent. So if the patient stays away from hypertrophic areas, stays away from areas that are subject to movement or pressure, they're much less likely to have absorption site problems. And finally, problems with Dexcom and Bluetooth connections are not uncommon. Well, what's all the excitement about? The excitement is about the fact that it's here, we're not waiting. DIY AID has been available using the system that we now use by default, so an Omnipod Dash, a Dexcom, and a smartphone app since 2019. So that's fully 5 years ago. And you know, how is it that it's been available before retail version? It's because the open source community, which is a cooperative. You can see the hands joined over on the left. You can see the names of various organizations. GitHub is where all the programs are stored and downloadable by any person who's a member of GitHub. The Open APS community, Night Scout. We'll cover a bunch of this stuff. It's a big, wonderful community where people work for free to improve the lives of not just themselves or their children, but the whole community, the whole world living with diabetes. Well, it all started when John Kostick and his son, and Lane Desborough and his son, figured out how to remotely monitor with the Dexcom G4. This was fully 2 years before Dexcom, the Dexcom Clarity app that we know now came into existence. The next big step was when Ben West, who was a developer, he worked for Dexcom for a while, he was a musician. He basically spent 4 years of his life between 2009 and 2013 reverse engineering Minimed CareLink and hooking up a bunch of gizmos with the Dexcom to provide the first ever AID. This was 3 years before Medtronic made its first AID with temp basal available. So Ben ultimately is my #1 DIY AID hero. Dana Lewis, who had type 1 herself, as was an innovator, worked with Scott Liebran, a developer, took Ben's concepts with DecoCare and with Ben made it into Open APS. And Open APS was the first time a mass-produced AID was available to anybody who had the smarts and the patience. And here you can see what went into some of the first Open APS rigs. Nate Rackleft and Pete Schwamp took Open APS and improved the interface, tweaked the software somewhat, and came up with the Loop app that we now know. Initially it ran with a Medtronic, old Medtronic pump, but since 2019, as I mentioned, it has worked with Omnipod. How did I get into DIY looping? Well, I was introduced to Ben Mammon in 2019 when he was still a medical student. Ben is my DIY guru. Everything I've done, basically, I've either done because he suggested it or said it was possible, and he's guided me along the way. Over on the right, you can see Ben's bedroom with all the various gizmos he's worked with over the years. I should add that Ben is now works for Insulet, the Omnipod manufacturer, and he heads up Omnipod 5 worldwide. What a great acquisition by Insulet. Well, in 2019, actually 5 years ago to this day, Ben suggested that I host a loop meet at BCDiabetes. And here you can see a group of people, about half of them had been on Loop before and knew how to use the software and to build it, and the other half had never used it. So they arrived at about 8:30 on a Saturday morning, and by about 4 p.m. everybody was looping. It required building a Night Scout account, which we'll talk about later, as well as building the Loop app. I said to Ben, there's got to be an easier way. And he said, Tom, yes there is. You can have your own software engineers build the app, download the code from GitHub, get an Apple developer license, distribute it through Apple Test Flight, and then you can use Google Drive for the Android equivalents. You also need to have some kind of Night Scout generator that will save the 4 hours it takes the average person to build it. You need a consent and waiver to keep you out of trouble. You need to hire and train staff to do all this, and then finally you will be able to start people on Loop at scale. So here we are 5 years later, and in January of 2024 the Canadian Journal of Diabetes published our experience with the first 248 loopers. Now you can see that there are 3 DIY apps that we use. There's one that's actually called Loop. We had 108. IAPS, which is a more advanced version of running on an iPhone, 114, and then 26 people running Android APS. Overall, time in range rose from 64 to 80%. Time below range fell from 3.5 to 2.5%. And the proportion of people who had a time in range of greater than 70% essentially doubled from 43 to 84%. GMI fell from 7.3 to 6.7, and lab A1C fell from 7.2 to 6.7. What about quality of life? Well, we measured diabetes distress, and it started at a fairly mild level and fell significantly. We measured fear of hypoglycemia. It started at a moderately low level and it fell to a low level at 28.8. And then the insomnia index also fell moderately. In preparation for this talk, I did a snapshot of our clinic, as you can see, about a month ago. And at that time, we had 108 clients on either Tandem or Medtronic, and we had 1,147 on Loop. Of those, 70% were using the Loop app, which will be the focus of most of my talk today, running on an iPhone. 16% are running Android APS on Android phones, and 14% on AIPS. You can see the distribution is that it's mostly iPhone dominated. It's 2/3 adult, 1/3 pediatric. 3% are over the age of 70, 12% under 10. Nearly all the visits are virtual. I think this is a guesstimate, and in the last month that I've been preparing the talk, I now think it's closer to 95% of people are started on Loop virtually on a Zoom call. Where do we get these patients? About just under 2/3 from BC and the rest from across Canada. In the last month, I would say at least half are coming from the rest of Canada. We've had a client from every single province or territory of Canada. What about our glycemic outcomes from a month ago? In total, we've had 728 adults, averaging 42. The A1C has dropped 0.8. The time in range has risen by 13.5%. The GMIs has fallen by about 0.5. And the proportion of patients whose time in range was 70% or higher continues to double. So from 31% pre-loop to 63% on loop. In pediatrics, 364 patients, average age 11. The A1C drop is a bit lower at 0.5. The time in range rise is a bit lower at 8.4. You can see the GMI is also falling, and the proportion of people who reach a time in range of 70 is again doubling. How many glycemic emergencies have we had? We've had very few. So over a total of 13.4 100 patient years, or 1,340 patient years, we've had no DKAs, and we've had 10 severe lows. In adults and in children, 1 DKA and 7 severe lows. I should add that the 1 DKA that occurred was in a child who had a pod failure, and we'll talk about that later, but she had her high alarm on her Dexcom turned off. So she went all night with no insulin, had a DKA, and of course survived to tell the story. The quality of life outcomes are the ones that I'm most excited about, because you saw my opening slide with people jumping for joy. It's the improvement in the quality of life. It's mums and dads sleeping through the night. It's mums and dads not worrying about their kids. It's adults just being less focused on living with diabetes. These are where the excitement is. So let's go through them. Since October last year, we've continued to measure diabetes distress, and we've added 3 other questionnaires: device satisfaction, diabetes impact, which measures how much negativity there is to do with diabetes, and then device expectation. In adults, you can see that on average, diabetes distress has fallen. Anything below 2.0 is considered low. Diabetes satisfaction, device satisfaction, in other words, how you feel about Loop, has risen by 14%. In diabetes impact, the negative side has fallen fully by 30%. This I find impressive, and this is what resonates when we talk to our clients. Device expectation with Loop started out high at 80% and continued to be high. So I think really what that means is that the device expectation was met. In children, the results are very similar, with lowering of diabetes distress, rise in device satisfaction, a fall in negative impact, and high levels of device expectation. Well, if you thought that I did this all myself, quickly get that out of your mind. I have 5 current endocrinologists helping me: David Lee, Mei Ying Zhang, Mumita Saha, Claire Henderson, and Fatima Abdul Hussein. And joining the clinic next year full-time will be Dale Clayton. But we aren't the ones that do the work. The work is done by our case managers and support staff, now numbering 23. We have 6 dedicated diabetes technologists. They're the ones who know the ins and outs of all the apps, how to troubleshoot everything, how to make all the adjustments. They can troubleshoot pretty much any problem. And I can tell you that about 8 of them are here in the audience today. So if you are trying to install Loop and need some help or have some questions, put up your hand and one of them will come over. I guess, we don't really want to interrupt the presentation too much, but they'll be also here afterwards for a few minutes to help. Let's talk briefly about AID settings and physiology, because I think it helps understand where we're at and where we're going with the technology. In mammalian physiology, ISF, or insulin sensitivity factor, is the only setting that beta cells have. So beta cells can switch on and switch off insulin release instantaneously. They have their own built-in sensor at around glucose of 5.5. So, the concept of giving a basal insulin is just unphysiologic. Now, unfortunately, the rapid insulins we have they're not fast enough. Onset is slow, hence we need to pre-bolus, and we need to give a carb ratio. We need to give a carb estimation so that our pump can get that insulin in up front to deal with the meal. The rapid insulins have too long a duration, so we need to have the concept of insulin on board. How much insulin is on board at any moment, given that the average rapid insulin doesn't disappear for around 6 hours? Glucose absorption varies by glycemic index and by protein and fat content. Hence, we have a carbs on board concept. If you're going to have insulin on board and it's more than a tiny bit, you better have carbs on board, otherwise you're going low. And finally, because Loop may occasionally run in open mode when the phone or the CGM fails, and the pod will just continue to give whatever it's programmed to give basally, it is important to get basal insulin rates nailed down. I've already talked about the 3 different apps. Today we're going to focus on the Loop app, which runs on an iPhone. IAPS is somewhat complex and not for discussion today. Android APS and IAPS are both built out of Open APS and are reserved for the clients who are most technologically advanced and who aren't getting what they want with Loop. Anyway, here's the home screen of the Loop app. Well, what do we need to know for our AID algorithms? We've already talked about the concept of insulin on board. This is tied in with the duration of insulin action. In terms of carbs on board, Loop offers a choice of 3 types of food by default. A lollipop, which is high glycemic index with an absorption time by default of 30 minutes. A taco, which is intermediate glycemic index with some fat and protein with an absorption time of 3 hours. And pizza, high fat, high protein with an absorption time of 5 hours. And then you can set up your own favorite foods. The AID algorithm is going to measure glucose momentum, in other words, where where are things heading. It's also going to factor in retrospective correction. Imagine the app predicting that something was going to happen in the past that didn't happen, then that would be considered a retrospective correction. So this is also going into the algorithm. And then finally, the amount of insulin required to correct sugar would be based on the predicted glucose minus the target glucose divided by ISF. The final piece to consider is that Loop works in two modes. A temp basal mode where only the basal insulin is adjusted every 5 minutes to bring the sugar to target, and a second, more advanced microbolus or supramicrobolus system that is termed autobolus. With autobolus, a microbolus is given every 5 minutes with 40% of the insulin predicted to get the person to target at 30 minutes. So every 5 minutes the system recalculates how much is required and gives 40% of what it considers is necessary to bring the sugar to target in 30 minutes time. Well, I know a lot of you know how to adjust people using tandem pumps. Well, the good news is that the settings in Loop are exactly the same as they are in tandem. Basically, you've just got to figure out an ISF, a carb ratio, and a basal rate. Loop allows for greater customization and more flexibility. With tandem, the target sugar is 6.2 to 8.9. In Loop, it can be from 3.9 to 10. Here I've got another column for Omnipod 5, which is not expected until perhaps the second quarter of next year. The target range with Omnipod 5 is 6.1 to 8.3. We're going to talk about presets. Custom presets allow a user to add an override that helps them when their sugars are high or helps prevent when their sugars are low, and we'll get to that more. Loop has an unlimited number of custom presets, and we'll go over them. Omnipod 5, I believe, has Tandem has limited, and so does Omnipod 5. In terms of dosing strategy, remember Tandem basal IQ had a temp basal only. Tandem control IQ has auto bolus only. Loop offers either temp basal or auto bolus, and Omnipod 5 only has temp basal. They do not have a microbolus every 5 minute correction. Loop also has some additional safety settings. Insulin can be suspended anywhere in the range of 3.7 to 6. It's 3.9 in Tandem. And in Loop, there's a setting for max basal, which we typically set at 3 times the patient's highest regular basal rate, and then max bolus, which we set at 1.5 times what the patient might give for their largest bolus for a large carb meal. For more on settings and comparing various pump systems, go to this short URL shown here. I mentioned custom presets. We have, I think, 13 that we install by default with every Looper. Our vigorous exercise preset gives 30% of the usual amount of insulin. We're talking ISF, we're talking basal, we're talking insulin given according to carbs, with a higher target for 3 hours. Sick day, we crank it up, we give 130% of the usual insulin predicted, with a target of 6 running indefinitely. Sick day insulin sensitive, if you're vomiting you're going to need less. For the week before the period, the menstrual cycle, we have a preset for 120%, we have a 70% for breastfeeding. We'll show that in one of our examples. And then site change resistance 130. If you've had some lows and you want to get the system to give you less insulin, you would activate this one at 80%. Now, you could customize it further to whatever you wanted, and so on with post-meal highs. Now, how much does diabetes knowledge matter? Well, if you want to get a good time in range, it matters a lot. we want all our patients to have good carb counting skills. We offer a reading list to every new client, and here you can see it with a short URL. We focus on what we call insulin experiments for people who have times in range and GMIs that aren't particularly impressive. And the 3 insulin experiments we talk about is a fasting experiment to determine what the optimal basal is. We tell our patients we want you to be between 4 and 7. If you're below 4, you're on too much, reduce it by 20% and repeat. If you're above 7, you're on too little, increase it by 10% and repeat. And if you're 4 to 7, that's perfect. We want patients to do test meals to prove that their carb ratio is correct. So we get them to take a known amount of carbs, use the carb ratio they're working with, and then take their carbs, take the insulin beforehand. And if their sugar's back to where it started at 3 hours, we tell them that their carb ratio assumption is correct. If their sugar hasn't come back to baseline, then their carb ratio needs to be strengthened. Instead of 1 to 10, maybe they need to go to 1 to 9 or 1 to 8. If their sugar has fallen below target, their carb ratio needs to be weakened. Instead of 1 to 10, maybe 1 to 12 or 1 to 13. And then finally, a correction for ISF. If your sugar needs to go from 12 down to 5, take the insulin that is predicted by your ISF, and if sugar goes too low, obviously you need to weaken your ISF. If it's too high, strengthen, etc. Well, what constitutes a looping candidate? The bottom line is, if they can afford the hardware, if they've got the hardware, and if they know their Apple ID and they're able to install and uninstall apps, they're a loop client, and we will offer them loop. A preferred loop client is someone whose lifestyle is non-chaotic, whose anxiety level's not too high, whose cognitive skills are average or better, and they have good diabetes knowledge. It makes it so much easier if all these factors pertain, but of course it wouldn't be half as challenging if everybody we took was like that. When you look at our results for our first 248, we pretty much chose people who were in the preferred category, whereas now we take anybody who knows their Apple ID and can install an app. Well, what looping hardware do you need? For loop you need an iPhone 11 or newer. For Android APS, an Android phone that's new. You need to have a Dexcom G6 or G7 running, and you need to have it running for a month. You need to be familiar with CGM, and then you need to have an Omnipod Dash up and running with your PDM. BC has a no-cost conversion for Eros to Dash. The rest of the country it costs, I think, $1,000. So in Eastern Canada, we have lots of people using the Eros pod, and then they need another piece of hardware called the Orange Link. You also need a rendering app if you, the physician or the CDE or nurse practitioner or case manager, are going to be helping the patient adjust their settings. A rendering app delivers glucose, insulin, and carb data to your desktop. Our preferred rendering app is Night Scout. It offers real-time data 24/7. It's fantastic. It's another one of Ben West's brainchilds. Every BCDiabetes client gets one of these for nothing. You can subscribe to Night Scout Pro for $6 a month. That's a good deal. Or if you're tech savvy, you can build your own for nothing. Tidepool is an excellent option for people who don't have Night Scout. Patients, your clinic gets a Tidepool code, and the patient sets up a Tidepool account and shares their data with your clinic code. They need to push the data to Tidepool before every appointment. Here's Night Scout. This is the homepage of Night Scout. Up here on the right, you can see the ambient sugar of 12.7. Over here, the time. In the blue is showing the temp basal insulin. So the dotted line you can see there is the setting insulin. If the rectangle goes above the dotted line, it means it's giving more. If it goes below, it's giving less. The wiggly line is the glucose, on top of which is displayed microbolus. Each one of those little things is a microbolus. Up here is a microbolus for meals. If you click on this section here, you get to reports, and that's where we spend most of our time adjusting people's settings, and we'll get to that later. So Night Scout is highly, highly recommended. Let's talk briefly about the patient journey. Let's say you see someone this afternoon in clinic, you think they're suitable. If they don't have an Omnipod DASH, fill in their letter of medical necessity, send it off to Omnipod, and they get trained. You need to do a referral to BCDiabetes, either online or old school. And the patient can actually register themselves at register.bcdiabetes.ca, input all of their diabetes information, and complete the waiver and consent for the non-Health Canada approved app. We didn't talk about that much yet at all. They can upload their time in range and GMI for research purposes. They can confirm that they have the right hardware, and they can complete the quality of life questionnaires that are done before and after. BC Diabetes staff does a triage based on a query of all the data that comes into our EMR, and we break the patients into lower and higher risk. If the patient is triaged as a low risk, then they're given an appointment typically 6 months from the date that they register online, and they're given a one and done appointment. This is an appointment lasting around 90 minutes, at the end of which they'll be up and running with Loop. High risk patients, ones who don't have all the preferred attributes, they'll be given a regular wait time. It's around 3 to 4 months. They'll be seen. They'll get a general type 1 diabetes assessment. We'll go over the reading list with them. We'll probably do insulin experiments with them over subsequent appointments. And when we think they're ready, they will get a 90-minute installation visit, the same one that the patients who got a one and done received. In terms of post-installation, we see them every 1 to 2 days until they're stable and self-sufficient. On average, it requires 2 to 3 visits after the installation day. From there, we typically book an appointment at 1 month, at 6 months, and at 12 months as required. The 1 month appointment is where we take our time in range and GMI snapshot of the last 2 weeks. So the patient's been on Loop a month, and we take the 3rd and 4th weeks of their time operating it. In terms of an annual, if an annual visit is booked with BC Diabetes, then the patients continue to get their Night Scout account at no cost. Their app is updated at no cost every 3 months, indefinitely. I hope you're getting excited. You don't have to refer your patients to us at BC Diabetes. You could develop the necessary skills to have Loop, to install Loop, and to maintain it with your patients, and to change their settings. And once you've done that to my satisfaction, you can become a BC Diabetes affiliate, and then you really don't need BC Diabetes involvement at all. You get the Loop app yourself. We share the waiver and consent, and you are responsible for helping the patient. Here's a picture of our first affiliates. They are a pediatric endocrinology group in Saskatoon, and as of about a month ago, they had installed Loop on 20 patients. Now, many of you may already have installed the Loop app. Here on the left is a QR code for the Loop app, and on the right, a QR code for a how-to video. We are not going to spend time looking at how to install it now, and so I'm going to fast forward through the next 25 slides. Let's now talk about adjustment of settings. Safety first. We're always going to fix lows before highs. Lows are the ones that get our patients in severe danger, and it's our job to make sure that we fix them. We want all our patients to carry a looping emergency kit, and in that kit, at an absolute minimum, is a pen of rapid insulin, a finger poker, and a glucometer. Ideally, they would have a spare iPhone, a couple of spare pods, a spare CGM, some glucagon or food, and finger poker, etc. In terms of settings, we don't want to rush in and make changes unless we see consistent patterns. Obviously, if someone's going low, we're going to change the settings to give them less insulin. But we're not going to rush to make changes initially. If in doubt, make no change. Carb counting errors are very common. Failure to pre-bolus is very common. If we see a bunch of things we want to change, if we see consistent abnormalities, in general, we're only going to fix one parameter at a time. We're going to fix the basal rate only, or the ISF only, or the carb ratio only. And finally, if you have to choose one setting to change, ISF is the most powerful. It's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. Now, it's worth saying, it's worth remembering, if the sugar's low, there's too much insulin around. And then we have to weaken our settings. Typically, we weaken them by 10% or more, often 20%, if the low was significant. You know the confusion that is around if you've got a carb ratio of 10. If you're going to weaken it, the carb ratio is going to go to 12 or 14. The number gets higher when we weaken it. If we're strengthening it, the number gets lower. The only exception, so ISF and carb ratio, weakening means a bigger number, strengthening means a smaller number. With the basal rate, obviously a higher basal rate is a stronger one. If the sugar's high, we haven't got enough insulin, we're going to strengthen the settings by 10% at a time or more. In general, if the sugar's high and the issue is overnight or fasting, although ISF might be the preferred change to make, I want you to change the basal insulin first. If it works, well and good. If it doesn't, you need to strengthen the ISF. I don't know if we have time to talk about that today with examples. If the abnormality is less than 2 hours after a meal, if the sugar's high, then you're probably going to strengthen the carb ratio. If you have a prolonged high after a meal, you will be better served to adjust simply the ISF on its own. And ultimately, you're going to follow up these people frequently. So if the adjustment you do doesn't fix the problem, you get to revise and fix. And at the same time, of course, you're learning, and so is your client. Okay, let's talk about device failure. It's a big issue. I mentioned that the true pod failures are very rare. The main problem we see is absorption failure. So here's a pod change happening over here, and they did a pod change custom override, so an extra 30%, and it worked well. But then in the early hours, suddenly, there's a meal, but the sugar redlines, and this indicates, in the absence of a very loud Omnipod alarm, which you've probably heard. If you've heard it, you know what I'm talking about. You couldn't possibly sleep through it. It means that you've had an absorption failure, and the insulin is being pumped, but it's not going into the skin. It's not being absorbed, and this means a pod change immediately, and a manual bolus with a pen to get started. Late boluses, they're very common. We recommend 15 to 20 minutes before. Here you can see a patient who has clearly, the sugar started to rise. They enter their carbs, which is what gives the pod the message to give the bolus. And here the bolus is late again. So the problem here is not that the carb ratio is too weak or that the ISF is too weak. The problem is that the patient didn't pre-bolus. What about carb ratio? We're going to go through some examples here. Here's a patient, I think this is day 2 or 3 post-loop, and they're late. The bolus is late with each meal, but every time the patient crashes down low. So the carb ratio, it's within the first couple of hours. So the carb ratio is too strong. We're going to weaken it probably by 15%. So if the carb ratio was 1 to 10, we're going to go 1 to 11.5. Carb ratio is too weak. I asked you to look at the first couple of hours after the meal, seeing if it's high. We have high sugars post-meal, so you would not be wrong to increase the carb ratio. There are some notes in the top right here by one of our previous high-level diabetes technologists saying that he would not have changed the ISF, even though I think it would have been a reasonable thing, because there was some a bit of a roller coaster effect, and that the insulin was shut off overnight at this spot here. So high after meals, you're not going to be wrong if you strengthen the carb ratio. Basal too weak, the sugar is high overnight, and when you're fasting, there's an extra note here saying that the sugar rises when there's 0 insulin on board. This means the basal is too weak, so we're going to strengthen the basal by 10%. Basal too strong. You can see the basal. So what I'm not showing you here is on the previous day the patient had a low overnight and we weakened their basal, and here they're still running a little bit lower, and you can see this negative insulin on board. The sugar's going down and the insulin on board is negative. This means we need to lower the basal rate. A little bit of a roller coaster as well. The roller coaster means too much basal or ISF. We'll get to that later. ISF is too weak. If you look at this, here the patient is high overnight and fasting. I told you right at the beginning as one of our first principles that if it's overnight, increase the basal insulin. That actually may not work with some of the more sophisticated algorithms, because the system thinks the patient will go low because the ISF is not aggressive enough. So occasionally an overnight high will be fixed by strengthening the ISF. Now this is one of the classic patterns that you guys are never going to forget about. Here we've got a roller coaster. The roller coaster always means the ISF is too strong. So we're going to weaken the ISF probably by 20% or even more to get rid of these scary lows. The next few slides, I've got patient photographs. They've all consented, and I'm, part of what I'm sharing with you is the joy and the excitement. Like, here's Jack, he's 14, he's with his mum and dad, everybody's smiling. I'm with Prince, he's our head technologist who's here today, and these are awesome sugars. Like, his time in range is pretty much 100%, so he's doing very well. I should add, Jack is 14. He plays tight end in football. He grew 5 centimeters in the last 3 months. He makes use of a lot of presets to avoid lows during activities. Here you can see these. He calls them save. That's for activity, and then he uses increasing insulin percentages when he puts in a new pod. So Jack's a great example of a success story. Corey, he's from Nova Scotia. We saw him a couple of days ago. you can see him going low after meals, bang, 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 bang. His carb ratio is too strong. And here I'm with Ali Al-Qahtani. Ali is one of our research fellows. He trained with Muhammad Al-Mathal in Saudi, and Ali's a fully qualified endo doing diabetes technology for a year. This example is with a client called Roger. Roger is totally blind. He told me I could use the blind word. He can't see, and he hasn't been able to see. He's in his, I think, early 50s. He went blind when he was 26. 20 years of diabetes, boom. Anyway, with the help of his CDE Robin, shown here, and his referring doctor, Dr. Rogers, not shown. This is a endo fellow in Calgary. We got Roger up looping, and a couple of things I want to show you. On Thursday of last week, up till this point, this when you see these microboluses, that means he had started looping. But on Thursday, he was using loop as a simulator, just like some of you in the audience are going to be, and he had an old AccuCheck combo pump into which he would give the boluses that Loop recommended. So Loop says, give this much insulin. He would put the bolus into his AccuCheck combo. But here he is. He switched over to the Omnipod, and you can see his first day was very, very successful. Second amazing thing about Roger: how does a blind patient fill a pod? Filling pods is difficult for fully sighted people like me. He was a woodworker, and here he's designed a prototype to help him fill it. So he slips the pod under there, puts an insulin pen in, and fills it. He knows it's in the right position based on the feel of the black underlay. So he's going to get a patent on that. And he loves the voiceover feature of iPhone. Helps him read it, so he just touches the screen and it tells him everything he wants from each screen of Loop. Here we've got Emily, the mum, with her 7-year-old daughter Clara. It's day one. You can see we installed Loop here at 4 o'clock. She had some overnight lows, and we weakened her basal. Excitement abounds. There's another app that goes with Loop, a companion app called the Caregiver app, that we haven't talked about and we don't talk about much. It is also open source. It's installed on the parent's or caregiver's iPhone and allows the parent or caregiver to give remote commands to the primary phone. So the typical scenario is the kids at school, they've got their phone. Every other kid has handed their phone in at the front desk. They've got their phone running. And let's say it's lunchtime, and the kid or the teacher or the teacher's assistant has logged the carbs in the system. So Night Scout shows the food, but no bolus was given. The mum or dad could give the bolus that's recommended based on the carbs. Alternatively, if it's lunchtime and the mum or dad sees the sugar rising at the time that lunch would be had, but the carbs are not logged, the mum or dad could enter the carbs, and then the system, it wouldn't give them the mealtime bolus based on carb counting, but it would give the microbolus corrections. And finally, the Loop Caregiver app can be used to activate the presets we talked about. The commonest one being sporting exercise apps where the target is raised to 9 and the proportion of insulin is reduced to around 70%. How about some more excitement? Audrey is from the Yukon, and she's got baby Marlo, who she's nursing. The daytime lows you see here, these are mostly due to breastfeeding, and we set up for her a 70% nursing override. So that the target was 7.5 and it would give 70% of the usual insulin. You can also see that she had a low with breakfast here, and you can see that she didn't pre-bolus. I guess she's allowed, being a mum is hard enough. So anyway, we weakened her carb ratio at breakfast as well. We have about 20 type 1 diabetes in pregnancy clients, and here you can see the targets we use of 3.5 to 7.7, and the really awesome time in range being achieved. I think here, even with these highs, the insulin sensitivity falls dramatically across the second trimester, and on almost a daily basis we have clients who might strengthen their ISF. Here's Adeline. Adeline is from, I think she's from Toronto. The diabetes technologist, Duncan, was booked. Adeline was booked for a one and done appointment. And Duncan said, Dr. Elliott, I'm not sure what to do here. Adeline has been in hospital 4 times in the last 2 months, 2 with passing out lows and 2 with DKA. And I just wanted your guidance and what I should do here. So anyway, I had a good chat with Adeline, and we went over, sick day management. We went over diabetic emergencies. We went over what happened with her 2 DKAs and her 2 severe lows, and I made the decision that we would install her app anyway. And we did daily calls with her, and you can see here's the installation here, and her time in range over the first 2 days is, I think, 85%. So, and I can tell you that since then she's also done well. So a bit of a gamble on my part. When I think about the dangers of loop, I say to myself, it's better than the alternative. The alternative is absolute chaos. If we reduce the chaos just a bit, we've helped. Okay, you're probably wondering what I need to learn about loop before I can refer a patient or before I can consider becoming an affiliate. What can I do? Well, first of all, I'd recommend you go to loop.bcdiabetes.ca, where you will find a lot of resources. Take a look at that reading list, short URL I sent earlier. There is a much more technical video you could watch called Looping for Endos. It was recorded by Dr. Kate Hawke, who was our previous Diabetes Technology Fellow, coincidentally from my hometown of Brisbane, Australia. There is an online way to train in DIY AID, and here's the short URL. You can go there and you can actually not just learn about loop, you can actually do an examination in loop, and if you pass it and get a certificate and show it to me, that is the first step to becoming a diabetes affiliate. If you've had fun using the app you've installed today, I invite you to ask for an extension on the life of the app. By the way, the app will self-destruct, I think, on October the 24th. So we'd be happy to extend the simulator for you. We will invite you to visit BC Diabetes this morning or this afternoon during a coffee break. And of course, if you're keen to join BC Diabetes, we're hiring. This is just to remind me that without my amazing staff, none of this would be possible. What about the future? The future is so exciting. You've all heard about National Pharmacare. It was passed in the Senate. It became law, I think, 2 weeks ago. Adrian Dix tells me that BC will sign up the moment it's possible, which is about now. Don Davies, NDP member for Vancouver Kingsway, who helped push this along when the NDP was still in the coalition with the Libs, tells me that CGM and pumps, which are not part of the primary National Pharmacare bill, will be covered in the first year with $100 million fund that will be renewed. I told him it would only, allow for about 10% of Canada's loopers, 10% of Canadians who want to go on AID. And I'm not just talking loop now, I'm talking any flavour. Hopefully Tandem and Medtronic will be fully covered, as will Omnipod 5 when it comes, as will CAM APS when it comes. So National Pharmacare, I think, opens the floodgates. We've got 300,000 type 1s in Canada. I reckon that 200,000 could easily be put on AID within the next few years. I don't see anything, as long as a patient is willing to sign a waiver and consent, I think Loop is at least as good an option as Tandem and Medtronic, and if you live in BC, it's fully covered once you hit the deductible. Omnipod 5 only has a temp basal algorithm. They probably won't have super microbolus, auto bolus algorithm for another 3 or 4 years, so I don't see 05 threatening looping in any way, shape or form. So I think we're still going to be looping. We're going to be putting more and more people on loop. At some point, Apple is going to allow side loading of apps, which will mean it will be much easier to keep your Loop app up to date. And I think at some point in the future, Loop may well gain Health Canada approval and go mainstream. So no consent and waiver are required. And thank you very much. I'm open for questions.